Bobby Lee Claremont in the Criminal Element by Jeannie Mobley. Somewhere near the Mississippi state line, 9:55 a.m. I slid across the seat to the wall and looked out the window. The swamps with their curtains of drooping moss were giving way to farmland as we neared the state line. Louisiana was almost behind me for good. I chewed my lip and planned my next move. I had to play it cool. If these folks were criminals, they were exactly the type I wanted to impress. Not that I wanted to fall in with a gang of murderers, but Hayworth could have just made that up to scare me. Besides, these people were clean, well dressed. They looked respectable, in the way that only money and comfortable living could make a person respectable. And that was the kind of respectable I wanted to be. After all, if my criminal ambitions only extended as far as pocket-picking and back-alley thuggery, I could have stayed in New Orleans. I was headed to Chicago, where, according to the papers, the crooks walked the streets in three-piece suits and dined with the mayor. That was the kind of criminal element I belonged with, and if this was the first encounter with them, I didn't want to look like a rube straight off the bayous. Of course, I would have to tread carefully with a cop in the car. I wished I hadn't told Sergeant Hayworth my real name. That was hardly a way to impress members of the underworld, if that was, in fact, what they were. Maybe the smell of those corn pones had addled my brain. After eating just two of them, my mouth was starting to feel more parched than the Great Sahara, so I headed for the lavatory at the rear of the carriage. It was a tiny space, just big enough for a sink and a toilet, which was really more just a hole opening right out over the tracks. At the sink, I pumped a little water into my cupped hand and drank. It tasted stale and coppery, but it would do. I pumped and sipped several more times until my thirst was sated. Then I gave myself a good hard look in the mirror. There was nothing I could do to cover the fact that I was poor. The fit of my threadbare clothes and my untrimmed, untidy hair made that obvious. But at least I wanted to make sure my face was clean and I didn't have anything caught between my teeth. I wet my hands one more time and used them to slick down my hair a little, making me look like I had used a good hair tonic. For a few minutes anyway, until it dried and fell back over my face. "How do you do?" I said to my reflection. "The name's Bobby Lee Claremont, and if there's something I can do for you, something quick, neat, and discreet, I'm your man." I gave my reflection a sly smile. The reflection smiled back. Not really a man yet, but getting there. A few more years and I could start growing a mustache, maybe. Then folks would take me more seriously. Still, there was advantages to my smooth, still rounded cheeks, pink and freckled from the sun. I rearranged my smile into that of a cherub, all sweet youthful innocence, and tousled my hair so that the wet strands curled around my forehead. It was a look that had served me plenty of times. Combined with a tragic fib or two, it could get me a couple nickels from warm-hearted ladies, or sometimes a warm roll or a few bayonets for breakfast. The only person who had ever been completely immune to that look was Sister Mary Magdalene. But then again, she was a nun. You couldn't expect a nun to have a heart. I was still studying my face in the mirror, trying to decide on the best look for approaching gangsters, and wondering how I would do it without the cop noticing, when I heard a noise outside the lavatory door. It was a sound I'd heard plenty of times during my stays with the Sisters of Charitable Mercy, a sound I'd be happy to never hear again, but at that moment, one that might be useful. I turned the knob and opened the door to see the young widow walking the aisle, bouncing her baby as she did. She was halfway down the aisle as near to my seat as to her own. The child was screaming, and it had a healthy set of lungs filling the whole car with its protests. I hurried down the aisle toward her as if just heading back to my own seat. She had been walking the same way, toward the front of the train, and was almost parallel with my seat when she turned back, only to find me coming up behind her. She started and stepped quickly to avoid running into me. Her sudden move roused the baby into a new wail of protest. "Shh, shh," she said, patting its back. She tried to step aside to let me pass, but as she did, her long black lace veil caught fast on a rough splinter of wood on the edge of a seat. Another perfect opportunity for me. Luck was smiling on me at last. I hurried the few steps forward and, bending close to her, unhooked the lace from the wood. She smelled of lavender, soap, and Cajun cooking, and the scent made my head go a little dizzy. "Thank you kindly," she said, her voice smooth and rich. The veil had pulled her hat askew, and she was trying to push it back into place. But by now the baby was arching its back and swinging its miniature fists like a little prize fighter. One clutched hand managed to grab her veil and was jerking it to and fro, tousling her hair. "I'll hold that baby if you like, man, while you fix your hat," I said, reaching for the child. I knew how to hold babies from all the time my mother had left me with the nuns. Sister Mary Magdalene had sent me to help Sister Bernadette in the orphanage nursery whenever I gave her a headache, which was pretty often. The widow hesitated briefly, but her hat was sliding toward the floor now, so she handed the child over. I laid it face down along my arm and thumped firmly on the little back with my other hand. It squirmed once, gave a hearty belch, and quieted. The widow removed her hat and veil, then looked at me in surprise. I looked at her with plenty of surprise of my own. Without her veil, she was much younger than I'd expected. Her hair was a glossy black curtain cut in a smooth bob that framed an angel's face of soft, creamy skin, full, shapely lips, and eyes like pools of midnight. She is so pretty my jaw dropped open, but I quickly remembered myself and clamped it shut. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Where'd you learn to do that?" She gave me a smile that softened my joints to mush. I had to lean my hip against a seat to steady myself. I swallowed and untied my tongue as best I could. "From my sister Bernadette," I managed, and immediately felt a twinge of guilt. I didn't like the idea of lying to someone who looked so much like an angel. Still, it wasn't a bona fide lie. Bernadette was a sister, just not my sister. "Does she have many children, your sister?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, giving her a sweet smile. I needed to change the subject. "What's the baby's name?" "Jimmy," she said. Then a shadow of sadness crossed her face as she added, "Junior." "Mind if I hold him a little longer?" I asked. "I might be able to get him to sleep for you. I just love babies." "Oh, that would be mighty fine," she said, and with another smile at me she sat down on the seat opposite my own. I stayed standing in the aisle as the baby grew limp and heavy in my arm. I wasn't sure if he would stay quiet if I sat, and if he started squalling I'd lose my chance to impress her further. The woman folded the veil and set it on the seat beside her. "We haven't been properly introduced," she said. "I am Mrs. Nanette O'Halloran." "I'm Bobby Lee Claremont. I'm going to Chicago to visit my aunt," I said. That lie was getting to be an easy habit. Then I remembered my manners and how a person ought to talk to the bereaved. Lord knows I'd heard it plenty lately, so I knew what to say. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. It sounded just as empty and useless as it had all the times folks had said it to me. Her smile faded into sorrow. She nodded toward the baby on my arm. "It's him who's got it hard, having no daddy. He's the one I cry for." Unexpectedly, I found my eyes stinging and my nose stuffing up. It surprised me. I hadn't cried when my mother had got sick, or in the weeks I had nursed her and tried to help her get better. I hadn't even cried when the sisters washed and dressed her or when they put her in the crypt. But somehow, holding this small, warm, vulnerable baby in my arms and seeing the sadness in his mother's large black eyes, my own loss welled up until I was near to choking on it. "I think he's asleep," I said, and thrust the baby back into his mother's arms, eager to be free of him. This wasn't what I had planned on at all. I couldn't convince anyone I was fit for a life of crime if I started blubbering over a baby. She took the child, but she was looking me in the face. "You've lost someone too, haven't you?" I couldn't answer her. I couldn't trust my voice. I shrugged and looked out the window. I'd blown my chance. We sat in silence for a long moment while the train rocked us along with the child. "It helps to talk about it, you know," she said quietly. I didn't answer. She shifted the baby on her lap and gave a deep sigh. "You never saw a fellow as full of life as my Jimmy," she said, her voice warm as she drew the words up out of memory. I'll never forget the first time I saw him, sitting at a table at the Crescent City Supper Club, close to the stage. I was performing that night with the Clovis Dupre Orchestra. I remember the very song I was singing. She sang a few lines in a voice of velvet stitched with moonlight. Some of these days you're gonna miss me, baby. Some of these days you're gonna find you're so lonely. And then our eyes met, and it was as if he'd caught me up in a spell. I couldn't look away. Oh, but he was handsome, and he had dreams. He was starting up a club of his own, the Cajun Queen's Supper Club, right there in the heart of New Orleans. The world was our peach in those days, and nothing was going to stop us swinging from the moon if we wanted to. She was gazing out the window, a dreamy smile on her face. I felt a little dreamy too. I'd never been to those fancy clubs, knew nothing of the life she spoke of, but still she pulled me into that world. She turned to me with a sigh, and her smile faded. We were back in the bleak present once again. I would trade all that now if it meant having my Jimmy back. If I had known that club would be the death of him and leave his own son a fatherless child. But there's no changing the past, is there? I suppose nothing that's that beautiful can last, except in memories. No, ma'am, I don't reckon it can, I replied. I had never really known the kind of happiness she was talking about, but I knew that the happy moments were more fleeting than the troubles. Sister Mary Magdalene had told me troubles were sent by God to test our fortitude. I told her I didn't see why he had to give so darn many tests when he was supposed to know everything already. So now I'm leaving New Orleans, hoping to make a new life for my boy with his kinfolks in Chicago, Mrs. O'Halloran said. She looked down at the sleeping baby and stroked his cheek. Is that why you're going to your aunt in Chicago too? Looking for a new family? I nodded. I had thought meeting her and quietening her baby was going to be the first step toward securing my future as a crook. But instead, she'd made me think of family and wholesome futures with a hunger that pulled at my spine and ribs like a 3 days empty belly. The train's whistle blew and the rhythm of the rails shifted as we began to slow. The woman smiled and placed a delicate, long-fingered hand on my knee. Whoever you've lost, hold on to your memories, Bobby Lee. Hold on to them real tight, she said. I looked at her hand on my knee, torn between throwing it off and holding it there forever. The door at the end of the compartment opened and Sergeant Hayworth returned. Mrs. O'Halloran turned to look at him. He looked back at the two of us sitting together, his eyebrows raised. She removed her hand from my knee and straightened. Well, she said, I suppose I should get back to my own seat. Thank you kindly for your help. I hope you find what you're looking for in Chicago. She gathered up her veil, situated the baby on her shoulder, and stood. She gave me one last wistful smile and returned up the aisle, leaving me alone, torn open by the raw ache of loss.